4 years ago, I started learning to sew with the goal of eventually being able to recreate historical clothing using period-accurate sewing techniques and research from primary sources. I wanted to be able to read a garment and know how it was created and understand how now obsolete practices fit into the period in which a piece was created, and learn to emulate that sort of careful shaping and padding that builds a historical silhouette even in everyday clothing that's now gone from modern fashion. Learning to sew was a lot harder than I anticipated, and so I recalibrated my goals a bit and spent the last few years practicing on vintage styles from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, trying my best to stay away from strictly modern sewing techniques and using true vintage patterns, drafting techniques, and sewing manuals when I could. And I feel like in the past few months, I've gotten to a point where I can consistently create pieces that resemble the vintage silhouettes I'm striving for, fit my body, and have a level of workmanship that I'm proud of. And so this summer just felt like the right time to finally begin the journey that I'd originally set out to do and try historical costuming. Everyone always says that the Regency Era is the easiest period to start sewing in, and I guess that's what influenced my decision to choose it. Going into this, I didn't know a ton about Regency fashion. Most of what I knew centered around the late Victorian era, so I had to do a bit of research. Just to give a brief overview, historically the Regency era is technically 1811 to 1820, but culturally, and more importantly fashion-wise, it spans from the 1790s to 1830. In the 1790s, fashion changed pretty dramatically from full skirts and conical silhouettes created through stays to soft, classical, and empire-waisted. This change was influenced primarily by two things. One was a revival of interest in Greco-Roman culture and art, and so you can see how the fashion came to resemble Greek and Roman statues. The other was the French Revolution, which, for a time, created drastically different ideas about breaking traditional norms, self-expression, and comfort, which all contributed to creating natural styles that lacked the layers and shaping required in the decades around it. Compared to other decades, the Regency era strips away a lot of necessary layers to just a bare minimum. I'm going to be making a chemise, a pair of stays, and a bodiced petticoat, and I'll be elaborating on the history and different options for each layer as I make them. First is the chemise, renamed from the previous century, but other than that, it's pretty similar to the 18th century smock. The way it's cut, extremely economically in trapezoids and rectangles, feels almost medieval, and it's interesting to see how a basic style can be preserved through the centuries because of its practicality. Around this period, cotton was beginning to slowly replace linen as the fabric for undergarments. It wasn't as breathable or hard-wearing, but new inventions in industrial cotton production made it less expensive. The Workwoman's Guide from 1837, which is widely regarded as the first comprehensive sewing manual and was intended for lower or middle-class women looking to save money, or upper-class women who wanted to sew for charity, says, quote, "Shifts are generally made of fine Irish linen or calico for the upper classes, and of stout linen or strong but soft calico for the poor children." The lightweight cotton lawn I chose probably wouldn't have been the most durable, but since this is the same fabric that I used for the petticoat, I thought its weight and its drape would really lend itself to the era. What you see me cutting out right now is the draft for the early 19th century chemise from Elizabeth Friendship's book, Making Working Women's Costume. This pattern is pretty similar to the drafts given in the Workwoman's Guide, but I just found it easier to follow than the historical pattern. The modern pattern was one size fits all, while the historical pattern was sized in largest size, smaller size, second size, and first size, and was measured in yards and ells. I did, however, read through the 1830s shift pattern and found it included different cutting layouts for different widths of fabrics. Ideally, your fabric should be the width of the shift at the waist and twice as long as the total length so that you don't have to put in shoulder seams. It tapers in towards the shoulders, and the triangles that are cut away are sewn to the bottom of the shift as godets. That's how I constructed my shift, but if the fabric was wider, say 1.5 times the width of the shift, then the shift would have been drafted and cut crossed, which involved folding the fabric in order to best use the extra width. Given that this book is from 1837, it also provides another shift pattern with a yoke at the neckline, which more closely resembles later Victorian chemises. As for cutting out the neckline, Workwoman's Guide advises, quote, "The hollowing at the back of the shift is not so deep as in the front, therefore great care must be taken in cutting the one not to injure the shape of the other, and in order to ensure the two halves of each side being cut to correspond, it is advisable to cut the shapes of the parts to be hollowed out in paper, to lay the paper on the linen, and cut by it." I didn't do the paper technique. Instead, I diverted from both the patterns and drafted 1/4 of the shift onto my folded fabric so that it would be a bit more precise. So my pattern pieces ended up being the body of the shift cut without shoulder seams, rectangular sleeves, square sleeve gussets, and 4 triangular goutets. Because there are so few seams on this garment, I actually went straight into working on the sleeves, pinning and sewing 2 sides of the gusset to the 2 short sides of the sleeve. I've marked the seam allowance on the gusset using pencil, because while sewing in a gusset, it's important to stop and end the line of stitching without going into the seam allowance. Adding gussets into the sleeve just allows them more mobility when you raise your arm. After sewing the sleeve seam below the gusset, I then sewed the gusset to the side seams of the shift. I sewed the side seam below the gusset, then I repeated it all for the other side. I know in the intro I was talking about how I think striving for historical accuracy is, in my opinion, one of the coolest parts of projects like this, but given that this is my first real historical sewing project, it's also important to be reasonable. Maybe one day I'll have the time and money to backstitch a finely woven linen shift entirely by hand, but for this project, my polyester sewing thread and machine stitching will have to do. I hope it's clear that I tried to do as much of my own research as possible, but given my experience level, I had to step away from some of the challenges in historical sewing, especially when making the stays. Still, I tried to keep a hand-sewn feel, like I did all of the hemming, buttonholes, and eyelets by hand. In order to add the goutets into the chemise, first I had to sew the 2 triangles together on their straight side. Then I could pin and sew them into the side seams. You might notice that I chose not to make a pair of drawers for this project. I did a bit of research online, and it seems like they might have been worn for warmth, modesty, or riding, or by some classes and not others due to the stigma they carried, but I saw a lot of conflicting information about how common they were. However, it's pretty agreed upon that by the 1830s most women were wearing them. Now that the chemise was fully constructed, there were a few hand-worked details I had to do, first being the eyelets at the center front of the chemise. In order to tighten the neckline, there's a drawstring that's run through the hemmed top edge and it feeds through the 2 eyelets on the center front. These were the first hand-done eyelets I've done, and I worked them in red polyester sewing thread because I forgot about the silk thread that I bought for all the handwork in this project. I chose red because red was the most common color for marking initials, dates, or numbers on linens that were sent away to be washed, and I wanted to do that on my chemise and petticoat, and I wanted the eyelets to match. I'll elaborate a bit more about laundering clothes and marking when I come to it later. Then I started turning and felling all the hems, which included the top edge, the bottom edge, and the sleeves. I don't think I filmed it because I did it late at night, but I also finished all the seams on the chemise, trimming away one side of the seam allowance to 1/4 inch and folding the other seam allowance over it. Excluding the research, I actually made this entire chemise in a day. I think I was felling seams until 1 AM after sewing for the entire day. I also made this tie for the neckline. It's just cotton crochet thread that I twisted until it doubled up onto itself. I don't have any historical precedent for this, but it was just an easy solution using what I had on hand. And I'm just using a plastic yarn needle to feed it through the channel. I was a little scared that this chemise was going to be too large on me, but it ended up being perfect because any extra fabric just sit under the stays. And the large neckline allows it to be easily hidden under the bodiced petticoat so that it doesn't show on the finished dress. The next layer I had to make was the stays. I've never made stays or corsets before, so I decided to use Red Threaded's 1810s short stays pattern. As expected, I made a few alterations, narrowing the bust gussets, lowering the top edge, and narrowing the back panel slightly. Just for fun, I decided to add an outer layer of silk habitai that's a neutral brownish gray. And following the instructions for the pattern, I also bought a structural cotton twill. Looking back on it, these fabrics were really difficult to stitch through, and such a stiff cotton definitely wouldn't have been used on these lightweight Regency stays, if at all in 19th century corsetry, so I kind of regret that. As I cut my pattern pieces out, I'll give a bit of background about stays in this period. In the late 18th century, though there were distinctions at first, the terms stays and corsets were beginning to be used interchangeably, and somewhere in the first half of the 19th century, the term stays was phased out entirely. In my research, the 3 types that I saw most commonly were half stays, which is what I'm making today, unstructured half stays, which were tied into place, and full-length stays that were mostly stiffened with quilting or cording, not boning. Full-length stays were probably the most common, and they provide a bit more support than the other options, but they lack the whalebone boning of 18th century stays and later 19th century corsets. These unstructured half stays go by a few names, including the Circassian corset, and Nicole Rudolph has a great video about Regency stays and corsets where she elaborates a bit more on this unusual garment. Lastly, we have short stays, which are quite popular among historical costumers today, but I couldn't find as many examples in museums or fashion plates compared with the others, which was surprising. Of course, there are exceptions like this from the middle of the century, but by the 1820s and 30s, as the waistline dropped towards its natural position, corded or lightly boned full-length corsets became the norm as the others disappeared. If you noticed, I cut all my pattern pieces on a single layer of fabric so that I could more precisely align the grain of the fabric. Then I basted all my pieces together by hand in preparation for sewing. On 1830s stays, the Workwoman's Guide advises, quote, "If for ladies, they are made of sateen or best French jean, if you'll notice, both cotton fabrics. If of an inferior quality, they are made of white, brown, gray, or nankeen jean, and lined with calico between the doubles. The stay is generally lined between the two pieces of jean with Union cloth or Irish linen in every part excepting the gores." I think they mean that the stays would be double layered with another layer of fabric in between, which makes sense if they're being stiffened with cording as well as light boning. Quote, "Stays are usually cut in 4 parts, all of which are generally upon the cross, which is the bias, as this assists materially in making them set better to the figure. 2 of the pieces reach from each side of the back, nearly to the hips, and the other 2 from thence to the middle of the busk or steel. There are 2 gores on each side for the bosom, and 2 larger ones on each side below for the hips. So this differs quite a bit from the stays that I'm making. I'd imagine Regency long stays would have had more similarities. I'm not putting a busk at the center front, this pattern has 2 bones there instead. And I've just been marking everything onto my pattern, including seam allowance, slash points at the center front, and boning channels. I created some boning channels using cotton twill, ironing the seam allowances inward, then stitching them to the inside of the stays. Most of the boning channels would be created later using seam allowance or folded layers, so I only had to add channels at the sides and the center front, where the boning is doubled to act as a busk, as I said. Next I had to add the bust gussets, so first I stay stitched along the edges of each of the 4 gussets and along the slash lines of the stays. I had a lot of trouble inserting the gussets into the stays, because the edges of the stays have to be rolled back and top stitched onto the gussets. But because the twill layer was so thick, I couldn't pin through all the layers of fabric or baste them together, so I just tried my best to keep the raw edge folded back. Catching the raw edge in my line of stitching was surprisingly difficult, and I re-sewed every seam multiple times, especially once I went to remove the basting threads and found that the raw edge wasn't secured down at all. It was such a nightmare. I really wish I could have done it by hand. I did reinforce the bottom of each gusset by hand though. After I was finished with that, I sewed the center front and center back seams on the stays. Historically, stays were often whip-stitched right sides together with their seam allowances folded back. On my stays, I just used plain machine sewn straight seams. I just thought the different ways in which you could seam it together for strength were interesting. Now that the stays were sewn together, I could add the remaining boning channels at the side, front, and the back on either side of the eyelets to, quote, prevent the holes from bursting through the edge. Because my basting threads were holding some of the boning channels shut, I cut those out and then measured and cut the boning. This is just modern plastic boning that I've had for a while, but I know you can buy synthetic whalebone, which is a flexible plastic that molds to your body with time and heat as natural baleen would have. I measured each channel, subtracted the seam allowance, then cut my boning to match, rounding the corners as to not damage the binding. While I have some time, I'd like to mention the Regency undergarments that I didn't make in this video. First, tie-on pockets. Because of the slim silhouette and rising waistlines, pockets that tied around the waist and could be accessed through slits in the skirt faced a bit of competition from a type of handbag called a reticule, which was popular and a little controversial in this period. Tie-on pockets lengthened in response to the changing silhouette, and I think it would be really fun to make a comically long pocket with delicate whitework embroidery. I'm a bit worried about how it would stay secured around such a high waistline, but the Workwoman's Guide mentions some pockets being buttoned to the stays, so that might work. Another piece I didn't make were stockings. I thought it might be fun to knit them from a historical pattern, but I don't really feel like buying Regency shoes, and so it's probably not worth it. Anyway, next, quote, after the stay bones are put in, the top and bottom of the stays with the shoulder straps are neatly bound with stay binding. I cut strips of silk on the straight just over an inch in width, then folded them with my iron into strips of boning. There weren't any dramatic curves I had to make it around, so I figured bias binding wouldn't be worth it. I then machine stitched the binding to the lower edge of the stays, trimming any loose threads in preparation for the next step. Using the folds I had ironed into the binding before, I folded it to the wrong side of the stays and stitched it down by hand. It was pretty difficult because of the tight weave of both the fabrics, so I used a leather thimble to help with that. Then I inserted all of the pre-cut bones into the stays. Some of them required a bit of trimming to fit within the seam allowance. After the bones were put in, I could secure them by binding the top edge. There's a drawstring along the top edge of these stays, so I had to make a seam in the binding at the center front to allow the drawstring to pass through. So I cut the binding and stitched it back together with an opening at the center. Then I could sew the binding into place. I also bound the shoulder strap pieces. Before I felled down the edge on the wrong side, I tacked another 2 lengths of cotton crochet thread at the side front seams within the top seam allowance. These will come out of the hole in the center and will be tied together. After I filled the binding down, I could work on the eyelets. In total, there were 4 eyelets on each of the 2 back panels, 1 eyelet on each of the straps, and 2 eyelets on the front of the stays. So in total, I worked 12 eyelets with this brown silk thread. The weave on this fabric was more difficult to separate than on the cotton lawn, so I first passed a large yarn needle through the spot where the eyelet should be, then I used the gradual taper on my bird scissors to widen the hole. I sewed these eyelets much like the others, working 2 stitches in the top, bottom, left, and right sides of each eyelet, then making stitches in between to fill in the gaps. These eyelets were pretty tedious to make, but using a thimble made it much easier to pull the needle through the fabric. However, the thimble slowed down my sewing considerably and made it less precise, so I didn't use it as much as I should have. The Workwoman's Guide says that shoulder straps are, quote, made of the same material as the stays and backstitched to the front and back of the shoulder. Sometimes they are buttoned down in the front, which enables the wearer, by unbuttoning them, to dress her hair in the evening with perfect ease. Others have eyelet holes to admit of bobbins, which lace them to corresponding holes in the stays. This is pretty similar to how I constructed mine. First, I machined them to the back of the stays along the binding seam, and then they're tied at the front through the eyelets. For all the ties on these stays, I decided to make 3-strand braids of the cotton crochet thread. These stays are actually really comfortable. It just kind of feels like there's something around your ribcage. I'm really happy with how they came out. The next and final layer is the bodiced petticoat. Traditional petticoats, just skirts without the bodice, were more common, but because the outer dress fabric that I planned to use was quite transparent, I decided to add the bodice to cover the stays. I modeled the pattern largely after this example right here. It basically just had to cover the shift and stays along the neckline and possibly have a bit of gathering at the back to shape the gown. The way my fabric was arranged, I could only fit 2 rectangular skirt panels, both 27 inches in width, which added up to around 1.7 times the waist measurement of the petticoat, accounting for seam allowance and ease. So although I would have liked to have another panel, I cut out the skirt pieces, the bodice, and the sleeves. So this petticoat opens along the back, securing at the bodice with buttons, at the waist with a drawstring, and the skirt just has a long slit in the back. I added puffed sleeves that will hopefully help to hold out the puffed sleeves on the outer dress. And I drafted this pattern on my dress form after layering the shift and stays onto it. I first sewed the bodice together, sewing the front piece that was cut on the fold to the 2 back pieces at the shoulders and side seams. Then I made the sleeves, first adding machine gathering threads to the top and bottom edges. This sleeve pattern came from this video here, and I made it by widening a basic short sleeve pattern that probably came from one of my 1940s patterns. For this project, I added a bit more width and shortened it. I also sewed the sleeve into a tube, and did the same for the 2 rectangles of fabric that I was going to turn into cuffs. Then I cinched the gathering threads at the bottom edge of the sleeves and sewed it to the cuff piece. Later, I'll hem the cuff by hand. Then I pulled the gathering threads at the top of the sleeve and arranged them evenly, and I just set that into the armhole. I feel like there was a lot to discuss fashion history-wise with the chemise and stays, but the petticoat's pretty boring. It's interesting to see a petticoat with a bodice though. I feel like we don't really see that in other eras, though I guess the corset cover took the same role later on. It might be because the waistline is so high in the Regency era and petticoats can't really sit on the waist right, which makes sense because many other petticoats that I found had shoulder straps if they didn't have a bodice. Anyway, next I did all the hand sewing on the bodice, including folding back the back edge for the button facing, trimming and folding back the top edge, and folding the sleeve cuff. The bodice was pretty much finished at this point, so I started working on the skirt. First, I sewed the panels into a large rectangle, then I created the tucks in the hem, which I thought would help hold the skirt out in a bell shape. I was shooting for the end of the 1810s with this project, and in the 1820s, skirts really adopted this smooth, narrow bell shape. I also hoped the tucks would show through the more transparent outer fabric. However, as I said, the skirt was a bit too narrow, so I don't think it'll do much in terms of aiding the silhouette. I might add gussets in the petticoat if I feel like it needs it though. I did 2 tucks at the hem of the skirt, plus the actual hem, so it looks more like 3. On the whole project, this is the most evident bit of machine sewing. Then I sewed the skirt into a tube, placing the 2 seams at the sides of the petticoat, hoping to later add slits in the skirt there for the pockets after I judged the placement on the final dress. Then I cut a slit in the back of the skirt for the opening. I also added gathering threads at the top edge. I was hoping to evenly distribute the gathering along the petticoat, like in this example here. However, after I sewed it to the bodice and tried it on, I found the even gathering to be a bit unflattering because it detracted from the slim Regency silhouette. So I changed it to just be gathered at the back, which I was already planning on doing on the finished dress, so that might help with padding out the silhouette. While trying it on, I also caught an error in the pattern drafting, where the angle of the shoulder strap had to be shifted a bit more towards 90 degrees, which I achieved with darts. This might have been caused by the weight of the skirt pulling at the center of the front and back, or I just wasn't careful enough on my mock-up of the bodice. After fixing the gathering, I started working on the drawstring at the waist. I was planning on using the bodice seam allowance as a casing, so to prepare for that, I worked 2 eyelets for the lacing to emerge from on either side of the center back. Then, since I couldn't find the needle I used before, I used a crochet hook to pull the 3-strand braid through the eyelets and casing I'd made by turning and felling down the seam allowance. This will just tie at the back of the petticoat below the buttons, keeping the bodice closed. Next came one of the most fun parts of the project for me. So the Workwoman's Guide has a section on making buttons that provides instructions for making fabric cover buttons. I'm not sure how common this method was historically, but I still found it really fun to do. So it says, quote, cover your piece of wire with a square piece of calico, which you must double over the corners and sew it firmly in the middle. Afterwards, stitch the button round close to the wire, or else work over the wire with the buttonhole stitch, and in the center, work a little regular star to set it off. I used my seam ripper as a guide for making a ring from this jewelry wire I had. Then with wire cutters, I cut off the straight bits at the end of the wire. I then cut out a bit of fabric, worked a gathering thread in a circular shape, and stitched the ring into the fabric. Then I did a buttonhole stitch all around the outer edge. Then I could cut the buttonholes in the back of the bodice and work them by hand. This was my first time doing hand-sewn buttonholes, and they came out a bit strange, but hopefully that'll improve with practice. A few months ago, I was reading one of my fashion history books called The Pocket, A Hidden History of Women's Lives, and I read this section about how linens would often be marked with the owner's name or initials, the year, and a number. This was because historically, most women did not wash their clothes themselves. Since laundering was difficult and time-consuming, they'd send it out to someone whose occupation was washing, and marking the garments with identifying details helped prevent lost clothing. In more affluent households, the number and year on the garment could be used by the owner to identify and rotate among many of the same garment. Marking could be done in ink or cross-stitched, and the Workman's Guide provides recipes and instructions for both. I'll put more details from the book about it on the screen, and I also copied the letters and numbers from the included sampler. Although I'll never have to send my chemise and petticoat out to be laundered, and I only have one of each, I thought it was a cool historical detail to add my initials in the year. With that, I was completely finished with all the layers. Overall, I'm really happy with how every piece came out. The petticoat is pretty narrow though, and I can't step too widely, so I'll probably add godets into that at some point. It should also help with the silhouette on the outer dress. Speaking of the dress, I've yet to make it, and so if you don't want to miss that, feel free to subscribe. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time!